She gazed at him in shock. She squeezed her hands and then swiftly turned to put some space between them. She'd regained her composure and told him that she was Ileana of House Glane. She denied the name that he'd affectionately called her. "Don't tell me you've forgotten," he murmured and then suddenly grabbed her wrist. He pulled her body close to his lips a hair's breadth away from hers as he told her that he hadn't forgotten for a single moment, her voice, her touch, her warmth, her body heat. He remembered all of it. The crowd around them whispered at his open display of affection, but that was all background noise for them. It was as if they were the only two in the room. He hugged her close and closed his eyes in contentment. He told her she didn't need to pretend anymore, and she should obediently admit it. She stepped back once more and let go of the hand he'd interlocked with his own. She adamantly told him that she was Ileana Glane. For a man who remembered someone's body heat, she'd found it strange he couldn't get their names right. She told him with an indifferent voice that he had no place in her heart. But Magnus didn't like her words. He said in a low tone, filled with an unknown threat. "No, you love me. Because that's what I decided." She glared at him, but she felt anxious. Magnus grabbed Ileana by the shoulders. As he loomed over her, he repeated his words, eyes glimmering with danger. Ileana felt a chill run through her. But the Marquis pulled Ileana away from Magnus and shielded her, as he shouted out a warning to the Emperor. "Please don't recklessly intimidate Ileana with your actions. She is to be the next head of the Marquisate, so he had no intention of allowing her the Empress's seat." The crowd whispered at the Marquis' words. Why would he turn down the Empress' position, a seat of such power? And how brave he was to refuse the Emperor. Magnus folded his arms as he stood, looking as imposing as ever. The Marquis must have had others who could sit as the next successor. But the Marquis explained that only direct descendants of the Glane family could be named successors. Magnus, however, could care less about a marquisite's problems because it had no relation with him choosing his empress. The Marquis stubbornly said that because it concerned his child, he wouldn't allow it. Magnus grew annoyed. "Do you dare to deny permission for the Emperor's marriage?" Magnus questioned him. "Know your place. He was this land's emperor and therefore Marquis Glane's lord." He spoke as he raised his hand. If the Marquis desired so, he would give him a chance to speak next time. He grabbed Ileana by the arm and yanked her forward and she fell into his arms, shocking both Ileana and the Marquis. He held her tightly and smiled. Now was not the time to be standing by idly, because they had a wedding to prepare for. The Marquis shouted out furiously and stepped forward, but the royal knights stopped him as they blocked his way. Ileana called out to the Marquis, worried for his safety, but Magnus grabbed her shoulder as he stopped her. "Lina, don't move without my permission," he said. Ileana grew angry. She refused to become his empress because her permission is what he should have had from the beginning. "I didn't ask for your opinion, so I will not take it into account," he said as he looked down at her with a smirk. But then, the air around him changed frighteningly as he asked her if she'd given him a choice when she'd taken him in as a beast, only to later be tossed away. But Ileana was not scared because she mocked him as she said her mouth had gotten tired from repeating the same thing, from denying the nonsense His Majesty kept spouting. An emperor who couldn't distinguish between people and who couldn't communicate properly was more a problem to this empire, she said, sarcasm heavy in her voice. Magnus smiled as he told her this was the way to discover the real Ileana. He looked behind her at the knights and told them to escort the lady with care for she was to be his empress. Ileana leaned back against the bed. They'd brought her to the room as if they'd kidnapped her and left her there unattended for almost 5 hours. She thought about all the chaos that Magnus had created in the ballroom and how he must be attending to that. But no matter how comfortable she tried to get, she couldn't because the corset dress she'd worn felt suffocating, and the room they'd put her in was so dark she could barely see anything. She kicked off her shoes as she thought about how petty Magnus had been to announce her as empress. This shouldn't have happened. Silence settled around her and she smiled. She decided to deal with this unbearable dress and then sleep. She got off the bed and began the most excruciating process of trying to loosen the corset strings. Clearly, she'd overestimated the flexibility of her body because soon after performing such awkward movements, she froze as pain shot up her arm and she fell over onto the bed. That was how Magnus found her as he walked in. The sight of her laying motionless caught him off guard. He looked flabbergasted and questioned her. She explained that while she tried to undo the corset strings, she'd gotten a cramp in her arm. He laughed at her antics and got to work helping her with the corset. He kneeled behind her as he told her, "You always do the unpredictable things, Lina." But she lightly scolded him once again. She was not Lina, she said, and this Lina would be terribly disappointed if she found out. But he was the one disappointed. He'd remembered everything about her, he said lovingly as he nuzzled against her. His movements startled her, and she turned. It was she who'd made him like this. She'd tamed him and threw him away heartlessly, his voice still light and friendly as he smiled up at her. But she hadn't thrown him away. What she'd given him was the freedom he'd always deserved. He took her hand and brought it up to his face. He nuzzled into it, eyes closed, as he told her, he'd tame her because just as she turned him into a mindless beast without its master. Now he would be her master, his voice turned cold, his eyes unforgiving. He got up and grabbed her by the waist and she flinched. She had no choice because now she was stuck in the trap of her own making. He asked if she remembered what she first did when she tamed him. But he didn't give her a chance to answer. He gently held her face and spoke softly to her. "Locked up in darkness and all alone, that's how you left me. Now it's your turn to experience such helplessness." She slapped his hands away in fury. She shouted out as she questioned his sanity. But he indeed looked as if he'd lost his mind as he grabbed her arms. He'd lost his mind long ago. Had it been when his brothers abandoned him or when she'd tamed him and then ruthlessly threw him away, he couldn't recall. She knew she couldn't react angrily to his taunts because that would only confirm his accusations. He let her go as he said gently that it was okay to act conceited, but she had to endure as much as possible. The surprise she'd felt at the sweet kiss he'd given her on her forehead couldn't be described. Before she could question him, he'd already made his way to the door. The light from the hallway cast on him made him look all the more dangerous as he bid her a good night. What was he doing? As the doors closed, a veil of darkness descended. Not a glimmer of light could be seen, and this created an unknown fear in her. Ileana backed away but bumped into something and she realized it was the bed. She sighed in relief as she got onto it. She realized that this was one of the powers Magnus acquired in the story after becoming emperor, albeit earlier than she expected. The spirit of darkness. Was this because of her? Was all these minor details that had changed her doing? That would mean the original story was no longer useful. She would need to be smarter about her decisions from this point on. She flopped onto the bed as exhaustion overcame her. What did they want from her? Both Magnus and the author? She dozed off for a while until she was awoken by a bright light. She opened her eyes to find a thick thread made of light as it floated around her room. Curious, she held it, not sure what she looked at. It glowed even brighter, which startled her. As they walked down the hallway, Cheryl prattled away about how neglectful Magnus was for leaving the lady locked in a room for 3 whole days. He'd not given her food nor a sip of water, which set Cheryl off on another rant about his ill treatment. What was he doing? If this was all about revenge, why make her empress? She told him he seemed more like an obsessed person with his runaway lover. So what did he want? But he answered mysteriously, obsession or revenge, which one was it? It sounded as if he too didn't know the answer. He scolded her for her meddling and told her she was to serve him, and not Ileana, but Cheryl was only concerned because this was related to someone's health. As Mendez, she felt responsibility for the health of as much people as she could. But he waved her off as he made his way to Ileana's room. The spirit of darkness appeared behind him, and he ordered it to lift the veil of darkness once he'd opened the door. After dismissing the guards, he opened the door to find a composed Ileana perched on the edge of the bed, the picture of elegance. Nothing like the sobbing, begging mess he'd once been when subjected to the same punishment. He smiled. He'd expected nothing less of Lina. As she looked up at him, he asked her how enjoyable had she found her time in nothing but darkness. She looked at him, silent, but then dropped to her knees, an act which surprised him. He lost his mask of arrogance as he questioned her. What was she doing? I was wrong, Your Majesty, she said. I will obediently accept any punishment you see fit. He looked at her, taken aback by her words. She told him that the crimes she'd committed against him painted her as a sinner, and regardless of whether they were true or not didn't matter because an emperor's word was law. She would face whatever punishment he chose. He sneered as he mocked her for her lack of sincerity in her confession. What was she implying? Her opinions and intentions were not important to him because nothing would sway him from what he honestly believed. So he could do as he wished. Her words angered him, and it clearly reflected on his face. Ileana had long since had time to think things through and realized that Magnus wanted her to behave just as he did before he became the strong emperor. If it was the original Ileana, she would have rather gone insane than submitted to him. And once she was broken, only then would he have tamed her. But she wouldn't allow herself to break because in these 3 days she'd realized something. She thought back to the time she'd been confined in that room. When she grabbed that thread of light, it glowed, and she slowly opened her eyes to find herself sat at a table in a garden. But she wasn't alone because across the table sat a boy. He questioned her suspiciously, "Who are you?" But a sudden voice in her head threatened her to answer properly lest she be chased out. Ileana held her head, unaccustomed to voices speaking in her head. What was that? The boy stood suddenly and concern covered his face as he asked her what's wrong, but she assured him she was fine and vaguely introduced herself. She called herself a wanderer and to avoid being bullied she'd ended up there. The boy grew empathic as he was in a comparable situation. He too had been bullied. He walked to her and patted her arm as he offered Ileana comfort. He wouldn't allow those people to come here because she'd entered his dream so she could be at ease. But she smiled uneasy because the voice she'd heard hadn't belonged to the child. She looked at the doll in his arms, and it seemed to be a doll possessed as it glared at her. What are you looking at? It said, and Ileana jumped frightened. It spoke? She shouted out and it asked her why she'd acted so surprised. But Ileana was in the process of having an internal meltdown. She clenched her hands to prevent herself from what seemed to be the onset of a panic attack. Was it a ghost? Or was it possessed? But she shouldn't be surprised since she transmigrated to a world in a book. The boy looked confused. Was she okay? But the doll questioned her, wasn't she one of them since she'd entered the dream? The boy continued to speak but she couldn't hear him as she was shocked at the doll's words. How had she entered a dream? Wasn't Ileana the only one who could control dreams? Was the way to control a dream by entering them? She wasn't sure. The boy's voice jolted her from her thoughts. Was she unwell? But she assured him she was okay, and explained that she'd been surprised because this was her first time entering a dream. She was given permission from him as he told her she could come here from now on because she'd been bullied. Because she'd come so suddenly, it had surprised him. Make this place your refuge, he told her. She smiled and thanked him, and he pulled her along by her hand. He abruptly looked back at her as he told her there was a way to escape from the bullies. She humored him with a smile as she bent low to listen. Make them become sick of you. There were bullies that had made fun of his voice, so he shouted and sang until they could stand it no more, and that was how they began to avoid him, he said proudly. A simple solution, yes. Ileana smiled as everything became clearer to her. For those 3 days veiled in darkness, she did nothing but sleep. But while she slept, she spent her time in that child's dream, so it wasn't difficult to pass the time and she concocted the perfect plan. What Magnus wanted to see was the complete collapse of Ileana and then to abandon her as she once did to him. How would this end, she didn't know, but if she set the stage and planned every action accordingly, the ending she would come to know. Because this was Magnus' play of revenge, this play would end the moment Magnus abandoned Ileana. So, she would give him the surrender he so longed for, but she wouldn't break as he wished her to. In the end, all she needed to do was act submissive and obedient so that he would get sick of her and abandon her. "You're telling me to do as I wish?" His voice had dropped lower as his anger grew. He bent close to her. She would accept his feelings, all the feelings she'd trampled on. He grabbed her face, holding her in place. She couldn't move. "My Lina," he whispered as he forcefully kissed her. Their lips separated as they both took a breath. His gaze trained on her, eyes dancing with passion from the kiss they'd just shared, and he held her in his arms. "Remember this," he told her, "if there's anything you desire, you only need to kiss me as we did now to get it." It was time to move into a permanent room because this room was only meant for Ileana's education. He grasped her hand and brought her fingertips to his face. They would be married soon, and that meant they would be sharing a room. He smiled happy at the thought. He looked almost childish at the moment, and that infuriated her. But she couldn't show her fury, so she bowed and consented to his orders. "Yes, Your Majesty." But he grasped her chin and looked into her eyes. "You've used the wrong name. Call me as you used to, Your Mag." She graced him with a smile as she called him as he wanted. "All right, Mag." He radiated approval as his name left her lips. They sat in the dining hall. The room silent as tension hung in the air. But it seemed to only affect Cheryl, the two unfazed by the quietness. Cheryl was sure she was about to lose her mind. The awkward atmosphere would most likely give Cheryl indigestion, she knew. Magnus' voice pulled her from her inner monologue. He told her there would be another banquet held and her presence would be required. Cheryl told him how he knew very well that she hated attending such uncomfortable events, but he only smiled as he told her that he indeed knew. They exchanged light banter back and forth, and Ileana sat quiet as she watched them. She picked at her food but froze as Magnus told her that she would be attending as well because she would soon be the Empress, and she would need to make a good impression. "Of course," she said. She had no other choice since that was what he wanted. She tacked on his name like an afterthought, but he seemed all too pleased that she called him Mag. She requested for permission to leave, and Cheryl worryingly told her she should eat more. She'd noticed Ileana had barely touched her food, but Ileana had no appetite. She'd felt like a doll the entire time she'd sat there as they spoke, she'd said in her usual emotionless voice. As he granted her permission to leave, she walked to the door slowly but paused and asked him to answer a question. Did he perhaps want to kill her? He spoke after a moment. Did it seem that way? But she let out a little laugh and told him she's not sure. Then she left the room, heading back to Magnus' room. He'd imprisoned her for a week already in his room and had forbidden her from doing even the most trivial tasks. From taking a stroll in the garden or borrowing a book from the library, she was not allowed. At one point she'd spoken briefly to a guard, and Magnus had cornered her as he'd told her she was not allowed to speak to anyone but him. She was to stay in bed from morning to evening until his arrival. She was sure with so little human contact, she'd be happy when even he pays her a visit, which seemed like his intention. She fell back onto the bed. The difference between them though is that she had a place she could escape to, she thought as a red thread appeared before her. She grabbed it and it sucked her subconscious in. But, what was this? This was not the same place as the little boy. She choked as a foul stench hit her nostrils. She staggered as she felt the weight of the place push her down. It felt as if all her energy had been sucked out of her. Dizziness overcame her and it was all she could do to stay upright. It occurred to her now that the thread she'd latched onto was red and not its usual white. Her foot bumped into something and as she looked down, the breath left her lungs. She screamed and jumped back, away from the many skulls and bones that littered the ground. Someone spoke up and it shocked her more to find someone in this barren wasteland. He sat relaxed on a rock, blazing red hair and sharp yellow eyes. Who could it be, to make so much noise in another person's dream? Ileana stuttered, unsure how to answer. He sighed as he got up. Was she fearless or confused? He questioned her. But she would soon understand why she needed to fear him. He said the words calmly as he walked to her. Did she hear him right? She rushed out an apology for forcing her way into his dream, but before she could continue, he interrupted her. You guys arrogantly think that you're the only ones that can control dreams. His words made no sense to her, and he suddenly dashed towards Ileana, startling her. He reached for her, intending to grab her. His glimmering yellow eyes glowed with the intention to kill, and that frightened her. You always enter dreams without permission, and you terrorize. You torment and control, but why don't you rot the bodies of the people you attach to? He spoke with an air of superiority. Eating away at the bone, making them suffer a pain worse than death. Was this something of which he was capable? You can't stop me, he told her. As she looked at him, a memory came to her. She sat with the possessed Teddy, and she'd come to know that it was like her. They were known as the Dark Knight clan. It explained that the only way to enter another's dream was when your mind stays between the rift of dreams and reality, like a semi-conscious state. That thread she saw was known as the string of consciousness. When the Dark Knight clan came into contact with it, it allowed them to enter the dreams of others. It puzzled Ileana because the novel never spoke of anything specific when it came to Ileana's ability or her blood. Did it mean that one of Ileana's parents came from this clan? The bear explained that to control a dream, all she had to do was think about what she wanted. If they desired it, they could acquire it, usually. Just like how there are people like her who knew practically nothing about the abilities of this clan. There were people out there who possessed these abilities beyond the imaginary, some who weren't even part of their clan. He warned her that if a person of such strength ever approached her, she might lose her life. She panicked and slapped his hand away as she shouted out that this was all a misunderstanding. She'd come here unknowingly. He clutched his throbbing ears at the screech she'd let out. She'd dared to slap his hand? Ileana explained that she hadn't a clue who he was. There was no reason for her to control and harm anyone, especially someone she'd just met. He'd almost attacked her, she said, outraged at the situation. He stared at her, and then told her how ridiculous her explanation was. If she didn't want to harm or control him and had accidentally entered his dreams, why didn't she leave right away? She flinched at his words and sheepishly stated that she didn't know how. He once again looked ready to murder her. She told him that she usually left a dream once the owner woke up. He came to the simple conclusion that she usually got forced out then. She asked him if he could tell her how to leave, and he smiled because he wasn't even angry since it was all so amusing. But when had he planned to wake up, Ileana wanted to know, that way she'd be able to leave his dream as she usually did. But she shouted in surprise when he told her he'd probably only wake in the next 4 days, because he needed to catch up on a month's worth of sleep. His words set Ileana off on a rant as she nagged about how bad sleep deprivation was. Was he really going to stay asleep for 4 days in a place like this? He told her that this was a place he needed to organize his thoughts. It was the best place to control one's pride because what she saw was everything that he'd once lost. But what she saw could only be described as a nightmare. Wouldn't it be more comfortable if she were no longer there? He laughed lightly because a dream weaver such as herself asked a question of concern, and he found her quite strange. He told her that in order to leave, all she needed to do was imagine a door. She closed her eyes and built a door in her mind. A door that would lead to Magnus' room, made with high-quality wood, golden decorations, and a golden brass handle. A loud thud sounded around her, and she looked to see that her imagination had indeed appeared before her very eyes. She smacked him on the arm repeatedly, astonished at what she'd just created. Did she really make that? Well done, now hurry and leave, he told her. She grasped the handle, but his words stopped her. This was their first meeting and would hopefully be their last, because he'd let her go on a whim, and if they were to ever cross paths again, her life would be in his hands. The last thing she saw was glowing yellow eyes with a hunger for blood before she gasped awake and in bed. She was certain she'd made it back and looked to the side as her name was called out. It was Magnus, but why did he look like that? Panic covered his face. He sat on the bed and told her that she'd been asleep for 5 days and showed no signs of waking up. She was shocked. Had she really been asleep for 5 days with such a short dream? Cheryl had come to examine her, and her body was in a weak condition. The cause was continuous fatigue and malnutrition. Ileana hesitated when he asked if she knew why she'd gotten so sick, unsure how to answer because she knew that she hadn't eaten much recently. He looked at her with slitted eyes. "While you were unconscious, I had a lot of time to think," he said. "About what?" she questioned him. He couldn't recall, but it was painful, he told her as he loomed over her prone body on the bed, invading her space. He'd proudly said that he would make her feel the helplessness he'd once gone through, but now he felt pain at seeing her unwell. Their foreheads lightly brushed as he sat atop her, holding her close as per his usual behavior. Was she really so sick that she'd lost consciousness? Or was he only being kind to her in order to tame her? She held his hand that cradled her cheek. "Is there no other way, Your Majesty?" she questioned. He was an emperor, and that meant he owned everything within this land, so why had he chosen such a tedious method of punishment? Between a death that was swift and almost painless, compared to being pampered and then abandoned, which would be more painful? He asked her. She sighed but then reached up, locking her arms around him as she rose up. He grew uneasy at her actions, but that was instantly replaced by surprise, wide-eyed as she kissed him. Her lips against his sent a jolt through him and he jerked back as he called out her name in confusion, but she only pulled him closer and kissed him again. He clutched at the bed covers, desperately trying to control himself, but it was no use. He pushed her down and cuddled deeper into the crook of her neck. His sudden movement took her by surprise, and she called out to him questioningly as she shifted against him. He called her name, his eyes soft and gentle, intending to tell her something, but she interrupted him. She smiled devilishly and asked him if he would allow her entry into the library and a walk outside. His face changed as he realized she'd only passionately kissed him because of the promise he'd made to her before. He clenched his fist and Ileana gazed at him as he kept quiet. Was that not enough? Should she kneel too? She got up to do just that and he finally spoke up. He grabbed her arms as he told her there was no need for that. He pulled her close and squeezed her arms, painfully so, as if trying to control himself. He seemed to have grown flustered at her obedience, she thought, irked at his contradictive behavior. Hadn't he wanted her obedient and meek? He let go and told her he'd allow it, but he spoke softly as he told her not to get sick too often. How would he get the satisfying revenge he'd wanted if she did? He swiftly turned and got up to leave. He would have a knight ready to escort her once she was ready. The knight barged into the communal room, and she found two fellow knights lounging comfortably. He still slept since his return from Dark Night, she told the knight that came in. But what had happened? The emperor had given an order to escort the marquis's daughter to the library. They were outraged that the emperor would give the Storm Knights, the most feared knights in the empire, such a trivial task. But the Storm Knights were different from the Royal Knights. Before their pledge to the emperor, their captain's order took priority because this was the privilege the first emperor had granted them. Should they wait for their captain's orders? One knight nervously told the rest, while that may be the case, the spirit of darkness was under the emperor's command. A spirit that only existed in legends and something that was last seen 100 years ago. Gasps and shouts of wonder rang out amongst them. One excitingly told the rest that the spirits lent their power only to selective few humans. They were forces created by nature, all of which 6 existed. The spirits which embodied the 4 natural elements: fire, water, earth, and wind. There were 2 more primordial spirits. The spirit of light said to have existed since the beginning of the universe, and its parallel counterpart, the spirit of darkness. It said that the spirit of light was the goddess of Rejabar, so its existence was akin to the existence of a god. The spirit of darkness, on the other hand, is rarely summoned. It's said that it desires the darkness deep within the chosen human's heart, feelings of fear and despair. A darkness that is born of anger and thirst. So, the emperor must have experienced such emotions, they theorized. Just then their captain walked in, and it was a man with red hair. A knight commented and said that his black hair had looked good too. But he had no time for that as he questioned the whereabouts of the emperor. After she informed him that he was in his bedroom, he rushed out. They tried to stop him, but it was a matter of urgency because he ran with a single-mindedness to the emperor's bedroom, But there was something that stopped him in his tracks. It was the sight of a lady with the emperor. But it wasn't just any lady because he'd recognized her. That woman, he said rudely. Magnus cast a suspicious glance at Ileana, but she hadn't noticed. He rebuked the captain for his lack of respect and informed him that he'd need to treat Lady Glain with more respect for she would soon be the empress. Magnus' words halted his movements. No matter how long his absence was, he'd had to have heard of this the moment he returned. Was he not aware of this? Magnus asked with a frown. But he'd heard of the news since the castle buzzed with it all around them. He smiled and looked at her. So she was the Lady Glain that was to be escorted by the captain of the Storm Knights. Magnus couldn't contain his annoyance at the news that those two were familiar with each other. While the red-headed man smiled mysteriously, Ileana felt suffocated by it all. They'd moved to the library and Magnus had left them to tend to his duties. He asked for forgiveness as he'd spoken rudely and introduced himself as Pertot, captain of the Storm Knights. He was ordered to escort her while she stayed in the library. Ileana spoke up and commented on how different his attitude was now, compared to earlier. Was it because he'd been ordered to escort her? He walked to her and admitted that it was indeed true. But he had only assessed the situation then and he was surprised she hadn't hidden the fact that she recognized him, but then it would have been easier to talk. When she questioned what they needed to talk about, he asked her what was her ulterior motives for being there. But she had no such notion, she'd told him. All she needed to do was survive in the imperial castle, a place she'd not wish to be if it were up to her, she told him as she struggled to reach a book. He reached past her, hand flat on the bookshelf, his chest close to her back. "Don't take me lightly, my lady," he said. He demanded a straight answer because this was an issue related to the safety of the imperial family and the empire. But she'd already explained that it wasn't her choice to be here. It was the emperor that had confined her to this castle, so if he wanted the question answered, he'd needed to ask his master. She glanced back with sharp eyes, annoyed. He smirked at her brashness, but he felt the need to clarify something. He grabbed the book that she'd wanted and handed it to her. The current emperor was not his, nor the Storm Knight's master. Another detail that was different from the novel, Ileana thought. In the novel, after Magnus had formed a contract with the Spirit of Darkness, he'd obtained an oath of allegiance from the Storm Knights. But Captain Pertot explained that the Storm Knights was a mercenary group hired by the first emperor and all members were sorcerers. They were a powerful group granted special authority by the first emperor and because of this they were different from the Imperial Knights. The captain of the storm could choose not to answer the emperor's call. However, it was originally agreed upon that the Storm Knights couldn't act as an adversary towards the empire. The previous captain of the storm hadn't recognized the emperor as their master and remained unconcerned about all imperial-related issues. As his successor, Pertot wanted to do the same, but circumstances forced him to do otherwise. While the previous emperor remained bedridden and on the brink of death, the missing third prince had returned, and the two princes had died mysteriously. He'd felt the timing of all these occurrences coincidental. He hadn't felt mournful at the loss of both the princes, but the third prince's actions intrigued him. In the beginning, the emperor hadn't held much power, in fact there was a time it was non-existent. He explained that the weaker the emperor's position, the more the Storm Knights' military backing was desired. They were used to keep the nobles in check, but now their importance seemed to have been reduced to merely that of escorting a lady. The power behind the Storm Knight's position in the empire should have at least created a little fear in the emperor, but it was insignificant to him. Just where did he get his confidence? What was he hiding? Pertot of the Storm Knights was inclined to find out. He looked at her and said, amusement in his voice, perhaps the lady was the mastermind who manipulated the emperor and used him as a puppet. Ileana dismissed his words with a scoff. What a rich imagination he had. She never had such a skill to begin with, but he leaned on the table, both hands flat on its surface as he told her that was a lie. Because the Storm Knights were responsible for Dark Knight and the disposal of its demons, and with the addition of choosing the Emperor as their master, he had plenty experience with the Dark Knight clan and the strange magic they wielded. Ileana, who came from there, should know it well too. Ileana stared at him, cluelessly. She looked away as she asked him about Dark Knight and why would she have any knowledge on that. Her response only served to confuse him and he told her that was where she came from. But she explained that she had not a single idea about any of the jargon he'd spoken about. She was born here in the capital. But he couldn't believe her words. He'd come across too many who'd told lies such as her. This infuriated Ileana and she marched off in a fury. The evening sky was set in an array of colors, fading as night crept up on them as the light faded slowly. Ileana walked along the hedge as Pertot trailed behind her. She asked the question she'd been curious about all along. Have we met before? Outside of a dream, she clarified. But he laughed and teased her. Was she flirting with him? What little color Ileana had to her skin, drained away, denial heavy on her lips. But she found his voice strangely familiar, yet she couldn't place where she'd heard it. He spoke up from behind her and it all clicked as he spoke words she'd long forgotten about. His eyes took on the same look he'd had in the dream as he said, I'd given you a warning but it seemed you've forgotten. If we're to ever meet again, I'd promise to kill you without hesitation. He appeared before her, sword in hand, and it hit her like a ton of bricks. The masked man in Khotan that had taken the priest's life and Pertot were the same. She bumped into the pillar behind her as shock overcame her. She hadn't been able to see clearly back then with so many people around him, but even if he was the captain of the Storm Knights, had that given him the right to murder a priest? With the ability to control and drive people into madness or put them into an eternal sleep, a monster from Dark Knight that would become Empress, he said would be an act considered treason. Ileana's heart took off like a racehorse, all she could hear was her rapid heartbeat. She'd needed to think of a way to survive. He questioned her silence. He wouldn't listen to her explanation, so why bother, she told him. If you can prove to me you've never sinned, I'll let you go, he told her. An act which was impossible to prove because everyone sinned at some point in their life. She ran and her actions left him speechless as he stood and watched her disappear. He laughed and loudly said since she ran well like a rabbit, she should hide well like one too because no matter where she hid, he'd find her. She crouched behind a hedge, as she held her face, willing despair not to overwhelm her. She'd tried to escape but the garden seemed like a maze with no way out. There was a building off in the distance, but the hedges were too high for her to escape that way. She flinched and covered her mouth to hold back a gasp as his voice sounded out near her. He'd investigated her as soon as she'd been selected as Empress. High society's flower, the clever heiress of the Marquisate, but rumors soon spread because no one knew of her true intentions. She'd suddenly donated a generous sum of money to the temple and underwent training into priesthood. And when she'd came back, she'd kept a low profile and lived a quiet life. And he wouldn't have cared. As he spoke his voice got louder and clearer, as if he were near. It all aligned perfectly with the return of the third prince. His Majesty's behavior had changed and Pertot's suspicions had grown. He then became emperor and not long after he'd chosen Ileana as his empress when he was known to have no long-standing relationships. But it all tied together quite nicely when she'd snuck into his dreams just like a monster from Dark Knight. He looked at his reflection as it cast of his sword, moonlight bounced off the shiny object. He swung it over her head as she sat, petrified. He asked her a question she couldn't hope to answer and absolve her of her sins. Did she kidnap the third prince and brainwash him? She threw herself to the side hoping to avoid his sword. She couldn't move, fear made her legs stiff as she gasped out sounds of terror. She forced her voice out as she called for help, and she struggled to her feet. It was all a misunderstanding, but the problem was that his speculations were all accurate. No matter how she tried to convince him, she'd be on the losing end regardless. But it seemed he wouldn't even listen to her plead her case since he'd already made up his mind. He'd found her silly antics amusing, he said as he stepped towards her. Now he needed to do what had to be done and that was to purge and exterminate all who came from the Dark Knight clan. He lifted his sword and swung. Ileana couldn't move or utter a sound of help. Fear rooted her to the spot. Her legs gave out and she twisted her ankle as she fell, her head slammed onto the ground with a loud thud. Her body felt like lead and she coughed as she forced her body to get up, but she'd only managed to sit upright before he swung his blade once more. She needed to avoid this, but her body was too slow. Was this how she died? She closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the inevitable pain, but it never came. She opened her eyes just as she heard his voice. Magnus stood in front of her as he'd blocked the blow Pertot dealt. Magnus questioned him in a deep voice, the captain attempting to take the life of the Empress. Are you in your right mind? Pertot smiled, but it lacked its usual confidence. He'd put up a barrier, but Magnus had a strong spirit on his side to have broken through. Black tendrils crept up Magnus' hand and he suddenly pushed Pertot back with a sudden strength. Pertot jumped back and informed the Emperor that the lady beside him was from Dark Knight and for the sake of the Empire, the Storm Knights saw her as a threat. He asked Magnus to step aside but he refused as he told Pertot that Ileana was an exception. He then ordered Pertot to sheath his sword and to apologize for his insolence, but Pertot wouldn't back down. Because His Majesty willingly kept a woman of Dark Knight by his side, Pertot had no choice but to exercise his authority. He pulled out a red cloth and threw it into the air. He, as Captain Pertot of the Storm Knights and while using the power bestowed upon him by the first Emperor, evoked the vow. Pertot held the sword in front of him, his eyes closed as he told Magnus that the Storm Knights would pledge absolute loyalty to him, so long as he accepted the vow. They would obey any order given by the Emperor, no matter how ridiculous it was. His eyes opened suddenly as he said the words, but that is only if you stand aside. It was the Storm Knight's right to eliminate Ileana since she posed a threat to the Empire. Ileana stood quiet as she listened, but inside her thoughts raged out of control. He must be insane to have the audacity to point his sword at the Emperor, but she knew, no matter how crazy he seemed to be, Pertot was knighted as the captain of the Storm Knights, so his skills was extraordinary. She knew how dangerous this could get. Magnus pulled her attention as he softly called her name. He didn't turn around so she couldn't see his face as he asked her if she was all right after the fall she'd taken. He was relieved when she told him she was fine. There was no need to be scared, he told her, but she answered. Pertot was a captain of a knight's order, worry lined her voice, and he'd heard it. He glanced back at her, his eyes soft as he looked at her for a beat and then promised he'd protect her. He dashed forward as he told her to stand back. Their swords clashed loudly, and it surprised Pertot how skillful and strong Magnus was. Pertot crouched low and reached behind himself. But Magnus didn't give him time to pull out whatever he'd wanted to because Magnus suddenly appeared behind him and shoved him. Pertot flew back and made it just in time as he blocked Magnus' oncoming attack. Pertot, however, was no match for Magnus as he tried to fight back because Magnus wouldn't give him any openings. He dodged Magnus once more as he put distance between them. He had quite the talent for this, Pertot praised, but Magnus' focus had been elsewhere as he'd fought with a dull blade. This was but a test though, he informed Magnus. A test to see if he was worthy enough to have Pertot's vow. But Magnus just scoffed at his incessant rambling. Pertot knew that Magnus cared not for his vow or of his right to eliminate Lady Glain. He only cared about keeping Pertot away from her. Strength can't be seen with the naked eye, and with how agile Magnus had become, it could only mean that he'd used the power of a spirit as they'd fought. He sighed as he said, he too would be using a spirit as it was only fair. A gust of wind blew, but it was no ordinary wind as it swirled around him. Ileana's anxiety grew more as she worried for Magnus' safety. He called out the words as he asked for his spirit to lend him its strength, and a gigantic bird of prey suddenly appeared above him. It was the spirit of wind. Ileana shouted out Magnus' name, but he only told her to stay back, never taking his eyes off Pertot. Wind gathered around Pertot's hand and in an instant, appeared a long metal spear. He would take care of the distraction since Magnus couldn't focus on the test he'd prepared. Magnus jumped to the side as he took aim, but he only said that if he'd been prepared to fight Magnus, he'd have conjured a sword instead. Belatedly, Magnus realized who his true target was as the spear shot straight at Ileana. Magnus shouted out her name in distress, and just as she realized what was about to happen, the spear zipped past her, and it nicked her neck in the process. but the force was enough to topple her over, and as she fell, Magnus ran to her. She laid on her injured side and moaned in pain. Magnus dropped down beside her and gathered her into his arms as he repeatedly called out her name worryingly. Blood oozed from her shoulder and pooled onto the ground beneath her limp arm. Magnus' heart began to pound at the sight of it, sounds faded and all he could hear was his beating heart thumping like a drum.